Guys, so we're going to start fungus today, or the fungi group, and this slide just shows us different types of mushrooms or fungus that we might interact with in our communities, our homes, in our environment. And so the structure of a fungus listed here. Firstly, some of the features of a fungus. Fungus are, like us, eukaryotic. They are unable to carry out photosynthesis, so they are heterotrophic organisms. Even when they decompose and break down things, that's still them consuming something else. Their physical composition, they're made up of structures called hypha. Okay, and if you go at a more detailed level and you look at the hypha, it's made up of septum. It has nuclei within their cells, and they have branching-like structures that go out throughout the organism. And so on the picture here, we see a cross-section of the hypha, the septum, and the nuclei. You also have root-like structures called mycelium, and they do act like roots, providing nutrients and stuff like that for the fungus as well. The type of reproduction that a fungus is going to use is it's going to use spores for its reproduction. Okay, now, unlike other organisms, fungi can reproduce using asexual and sexual reproduction. We talked about this process before. So the asexual type is when they can take a piece of themselves, basically, and create another organism off of that. That's called budding. Sexual reproduction would involve two different fungus organisms. They would use their hypha to create spores, and the spores would basically connect, just like sperm and egg would connect in us. Okay, guys, we have three types of fungus that we're going to go over, or they fall into three groups, the ones that we're going to talk about today. And it's based off of how they look. So yeast, for example, they produce their spores in a sac-like structure, and therefore they're going to be the sac fungi group. Mushrooms, structures that they produce their spores in is like a dome-shaped or club-like structure, so they fall into the club fungi group. And then we have rhizopus, and they are unique in the way that they produce their spores. The word hardy means very tough. Okay, so they belong to the zygote fungal group. All right, guys, the fungal or fungus group plays a very essential role in our ecosystem, and they do so in various ways. For example, they break things down. They recycle those materials. We eat them, so they serve as a food source for us and other organisms. Penicillin or antibiotics comes from the fungus kingdom. However, they also cause diseases in us. Some extreme, some not so extreme, but ringworm, jock itch, yeast infections are all examples of fungus diseases that affect us. And they also form symbiotic relationships with other organisms. A couple of people mentioned the symbiotic, the mutualistic relationship between fungus and termites. That relationship helps the termite break down the wood that they eat. There's also lichen, which is a fungus that grows in the ecosystem. It actually is an ecological indicator of a healthy environment because they only grow in healthy environments without certain toxins in the atmosphere. Okay, here's a picture of lichen in various forms. Some of you guys have seen this on trees and stuff like that. Okay, guys, moving on to plants. Plants like us are multicellular. Unlike us, though, they can create their own food using photosynthesis, so they are autotrophic, whereas we are heterotrophic. They are also eukaryotes like us. Their cells contain cell walls, though. We do not have cell walls. And they also have various structures in their cells that we don't have, like plastids or chloroplasts and larger vacuoles, etc. We are going to differentiate between plants that have vascular tissue, or the bryophytes, and those that don't. Tracheophytes do have vascular tissue, and bryophytes do not. Okay, the type of bryophyte that you probably have seen is probably a moss. You've probably seen the moss, which is the first picture up here somewhere, especially if you've ever gone near a canal or if you go in the woods or whatever. You've seen some of these things. They do not have vascular tissues. That's why they're very small. They also don't have roots as we know them, but they do have a structure that kind of acts like roots, which is a rhizoid. And their reproductive strategy is to create spores. Again, they need to be near water because they don't have a vascular system. Vascular system allows for trees to be the height that they are because it allows for the stuff to come up from the roots and go up through the plants to the leaves and vice versa as well. Okay, these two diagrams here just gives us an illustration. Obviously the one on the right is much clearer. And so we have a picture of the vascular systems. We have roots. And what happens is that nutrients, water obviously is going to be soaked up through the roots and it would go through the vascular system. Photosynthesis occurs in the leaves of the plants, creating the carbohydrates and the food that the plant needs, and that stuff will go also through the vascular system to supply the other parts of the plant. So it works two ways. The roots obviously serve the plant in that way, and then the leaves help the plant carry out photosynthesis. Why? Because the plant needs the carbohydrates, proteins, and the fats that it needs to survive, just like we do. We are going to differentiate between two types of vascular plants now. And the first group is those that do not create seeds. They can grow a little bit taller because they do have a vascular system. So again, the water can go up through their root structures and it can be supplied to the leaves and other aspects of the plant. And so examples include ferns, horsetails are examples, club mosses are also, and again, they are going to be larger than the non-vascular plants because of the vascular system. Now, if you get a chance, go home, look underneath your fern, and you might see the spores that you see here under the fern. Or some of us have ferns in our communities, whether our patios, our backyards, or depending on what kind of community you live in. And definitely they exist in various parts of our ecosystems here in Florida. All right? And it's just going over the different phases of what a fern would look like. They do not have roots, but they do have root-like structures called rhizosomes that serve in the same purpose. Okay, guys, we're going to go over two different types of seed-producing plants. One is a gymnosperm, and the biggest difference between the gymnosperm and the next group that we're going to talk about is whether or not they produce fruit. These do not produce fruit, but we interact with these every year right around Christmas time because pine trees, our conifers, the stuff that we use our Christmas trees, they come from this group. They produce seeds using cones. You have a male cone and a female cone. One produces pollen, the other produces the eggs that the pollen will fertilize. And they are carried through the environment by wind. That's how gymnosperms are fertilized. Pine, juniper, and sequoia are examples. Just an illustration that goes over the life cycle. So we have a female cone here in the upper left-hand corner. It creates its egg cells via meiosis just like we do. A seed would be produced. That seed would form a cone. The cone is then going to form a young sporophyte. The sporophyte has a diploid chromosome number. That sporophyte then will produce the male and female cones through meiosis. And again, it's the pollen from the male cone that would fertilize the female cone. So here's some characteristics here. And I think I explained a little bit of this. So they're going to reproduce using seeds. And what happens is that the phloem is responsible for transporting the food of the organism. Okay? That food is made by photosynthesis in the leaves of the plants. Water and nutrients are transferred by the xylem. All right, so you are going to be responsible for studying the structure of the flower. You will see it again on your test next Tuesday. You're going to have to know that the male parts are here. Okay, the female parts, stigma, style, and ovary, and the sepal. Okay, now these things are where insects would be attracted to help pollinate the plant. To explain that picture, pollen is released from the male parts, okay, which are the anther, and then it goes to the female parts, which is the stigma. So then what happens is that it goes down this tube to get to the ovule. Okay, once it gets to the ovule, it's going to fertilize the egg cell, and that's where a seed is then going to develop. So what surrounds the seed is what we enjoy, those of us who like and enjoy fruit. And then what happens is that fruit then might be dispersed by that animal somewhere else. Okay, our types of angiosperms are determined based on the type of flowering patterns that they have. All right, so you got to look at the flowering patterns that are on the leaves. So if it comes in multiples of 3, then if the leaves we're talking about comes in multiples of 3, then what you're going to usually see, and they're thin and slender, they're going to be like grasses and corn. So if we think about grasses and corn, and we see how those leaves are made from the stalks, this is an example. So those are called monocots. Dicots have a different leaf pattern, and their flowers generally come in multiples of 4s or 5. Their leaves are a little bit wider, so it says broader. So examples of these types of plants or angiosperms are rose bushes and beans. Okay, so here's a description, pretty good diagram that shows us how each differentiates, compare and contrast. The two structures versus the singular structure, and then what would become. So if you've ever seen those veins on a leaf, those are kind of like part of the vascular system of the leaf, allowing things to be transported back and forth. And so here is the flower pattern that we see. So we see the multiples of 3 pattern there on the bottom, and then we see the multiples of 4 or 5 patterns on the bottom on the right. All right, so this picture just gives us the characteristics of the seed. You guys have that. And so you can see the differences here. You can see that the differences in the embryonic root, the shoot, angiosperm, as far as, it has 2 different seed types, monocotyledon and dicotyledon. And so, again, the importance of this plant seed description is just showing us the differences between structurally how those seeds are. Okay, we talked about the vascular system, and more specifically the tissues involved. There are 2 types of tissues that the plant uses to transport its items. So phloem is what is used. All right, so phloem is what's going to be used to transport the food for the plant. And that is going to be produced through photosynthesis. So the leaves take in the sunlight. They convert that into sugars, proteins, fats, everything that the plant needs, like the stuff that we need. And then it transports that stuff via phloem throughout the cell or throughout the plant. Okay? And then the xylem, what the xylem does is that it takes up water and stuff from the roots. And the evaporation of the sun's power off the leaves pulls the water up through the leaves. So it goes counterproductive. Okay, so it goes upward, but that's because, remember when we talked about how water travels, it attaches itself by adhesion to the xylem, and that's why it's able to go from the bottom up to the top, okay, because of adhesion principles. So these 2 structures, xylem and phloem, allow for trees to become very tall, very expansive and extensive. So the leaves and the roots work together, okay. All right, so this diagram just shows us different structures of the seeds. Okay, they all have similar characteristics. We have a seed coat. We have where the food is stored for the seed, because as the seed is developing, it needs nourishment to develop. We have the structure called the cotyledon. The embryo develops within. And so, we look at seeds as we're spitting them out or whatever it is from our fruit, but they play a very important role in helping the plant develop. All right, so when we're talking about dispersal, it just means how things are transported ported, okay, or spread. Okay, another way we can say is dispersal is we can say how seeds are spread. And so various ways, wind, rain, and animals. And some are shot out. I don't know if you've seen pictures of plants on, geographic channels, National Geographic or whatever it is, but some plants can actually spit out their seeds and it can go a pretty good distance. So then they land with the appropriate amount of resources, whether it's, they need sunlight, they need proper water, they need all the kinds of pH in the soil. So all those conditions are proper, then they will germinate. So just because you take a seed and you throw it somewhere, if the conditions aren't right, that seed is not going to develop. We live in a tropical environment, and oranges grow here, oranges grow in California, but oranges do not grow in Michigan or Ohio or New Jersey. Okay? So they're very specific to your environment. Things have to be perfectly, homeostasis and balance. Okay? Germination, or developing into the plant. So we see the seed, and what's interesting is that the seed actually knows, based on all of those proper conditions, it knows where to turn. Okay, so once it gets the proper amount of sunlight, it'll turn in the proper direction so that the roots will go down and then the seed and the plant will develop upward. All right, we've talked about photosynthesis previously. We know that plants carry out photosynthesis, but we didn't really go into the structures that are involved. And so the plant has a protective covering. It's called a cuticle, kind of like the same for your nails. It helps you protect your nails. They also have various layers where you find the structures. So the chloroplasts are going to be found within what's called a palisade layer. You also have the veins. And we've all seen leaves, and we've seen the little lines and structures on the leaves. Well, these are veins, and they contain the vascular system for the plant. We just discussed that. Talked about the phloem and the xylem. The stomata, that's where you're going to find your chloroplasts. Okay, so the stomata open, it exchange, the stomata is what allows the gas exchange to occur. So oxygen going out, CO2 coming in, or carbon dioxide coming in. Now the guard cells regulate the stomata. So they're going to help the stomata open and close, because you don't want the gas just to be coming in and out willy-nilly. Okay, it has to be controlled and regulated. All right, so this is just a visual of all the structures that were just mentioned, which you guys wrote down. We see the sunlight comes in. The cuticle shows us how it's a protective covering. We see the layer where we would find all of our chloroplasts. We see where carbon dioxide goes in, H2O goes out, the veins of the plant, the guard cells again. So it's a very good description of how a leaf looks if we were looking under a high-powered microscope. All right, the stem. Now, many of us have learned previously, maybe in elementary school, that we can actually, certain trees, not all trees, but we can look at the bark and we can count the rings and determine what the age of it is. And one of the interest grabbers that we had at the beginning of the year said, what is like 90% dead? And the answer was a tree. Well, the thing of it is that the cells inside of the tree are living, but that bark is not necessarily living. It just expands as the growth from the inside goes. But you do have cells and things, xylem and phloem, all throughout this wood here that allows for the nutrients to flow in and out. Okay? And so based on the stem and how the wood is produced, that's also a differentiating factor of trees. Okay, the final component of our plants is the root system. Roots play a very important role. There are different kinds of roots. You have tap root and branch root. So the branch roots are going to come off of the main tap root, and their job is to provide support for the plant, exchange nutrients from the soil, whether it's nitrogen or some other kind of nutrient. And it has different components. It has a root cap, has root hairs. And again, like I said before, the plant actually knows, or the seed knows, where to turn based on the environmental conditions. Based on where the light's going to be, that's where the seed will turn, and so it'll develop so that the roots go downward and the leaves and stems and stuff are going to grow upward. upwardly.